From your news leader, this is a live special report.
Hello, I'm Hope Sisk. We are breaking in to give you live coverage for the verdict in the Mandan murder trial. For the past few weeks, North Dakota has been watching the state versus Chad Isaak from gavel to gavel, and in just a few minutes, we expect the jury to give us their decision. We will be showing you that when they're in the jury box. Now, as we wait for the jury to arrive, we're going to bring in our Jacob Notermann live from the Morton County Courthouse. Jacob, you have been glued to this coverage for the last 3 weeks. Let's quickly review what charges are against Chad Isaak. How do you think this morning is going to look?
Good morning, Hope. The charges against Chad Isaak arranged like this. It's going to be 4 charges of murder, followed by a burglary charge, as well as unauthorized use of a vehicle. With these charges, when we go through the readings this afternoon, or this morning, I should say, we expected it this afternoon, but this morning when we go through the verdict reading, they're going to be going through them one by one, guilty or not guilty, for each individual verdict, meaning we're going to see all of those charges read it at a different time. So if you hear guilty for some and not guilty for another, well, it just means that the jury found that there was a mixed bag as far as Chad Isaak is concerned in this case. We're expecting them to hit the jury box in just a few minutes. The prosecution, we were told, is going into the courtroom as we speak. That's going to be what we expect in the coming minutes. So it's certainly a lot of energy here at the Morton County Courthouse. We're standing in the county commissioner's room right now where a lot of our post coverage is going to be. We will be having live press conferences after the jury verdict is read. From this very room, we'll be covering it live, as well as any kind of post coverage anytime today.
Waiting for this verdict to be announced. We were expecting possibly later in the day. In fact, we know that the jury has been deliberating now for 4 hours, 15 minutes in total before we got word that they have reached a verdict here. What can you tell us about the time taken so far in this case with the jurors convening among themselves? Does that tell us anything?
Well, it certainly says that coming into this morning, they reached a consensus that they weren't able to reach last night. An observation that I had made just when we were watching the jury release yesterday, when the judge asked the jury if they felt they needed more time to deliberate, they all nodded, and some of them nodded with what I noticed was a little bit more purpose. So it seemed as though there wasn't enough time to at least give them an extension for yesterday to reach that verdict that they were hoping for. The judge said yesterday that if given the opportunity, if they thought the jury was close to a decision, like within an hour or so, the judge was going to let the jury continue to deliberate late into last night and just let them complete their business. Well, the jury decided that no, they were going to need more time. And so they brought them in this morning, and they were deliberating for less than an hour. So at the end of the day, as you noted, less than 4.5 hours of deliberation over this case, over 4 murder charges as well as a few other charges. So that's less than an hour deliberating per charge. So that they didn't have that consensus last night. They certainly didn't have at least the momentum to reach that verdict going into last night if they wanted to keep going. So certainly opinions and mood has changed within that room, at least overnight. Some of the jury members possibly sleeping on it, just going over the final evidence. We saw the closing arguments yesterday. The state reliving the events of April 1st, going over who the victims were, their injuries, going over the video surveillance, following the truck, all of that footage. And then we heard the defense bring up all of the gaps that they noted within that video, the 40-second gap in some of the surveillance footage, not being able to really determine the path of one of the suspects being followed on foot, as well as just not being able to specifically identify, at least from the defense's standpoint, who that suspect was in one of the videos, as well as when we were looking inside the RJR workstation area and talking about all the issues that the defense brought up that they noted. They said there were problems with how much time was spent and keeping track of what time was spent following the evidence. So certainly, both sides laid out rather strong arguments, at least from their standpoint. And when watching the jury, some jury members were nodding, some jury members were shaking their heads for both sides during closing arguments yesterday. So at least going into last night, it seemed as though we might have been in store for a rather lengthy trial. But when they came in this morning, it took less than an hour. And in just a few minutes, we're going to hear that verdict.
Jacob, I think you do put into perspective just how much information was laid out over the last 3 weeks, both sides taking their own strategies to present their case. And we saw a lot of video. We heard from a lot of witness testimony about all of the evidence that was collected in this trial. How do you feel yesterday's impact was for the jury just to hear both of those sides wrap things up into their closing arguments? Was that going to be a powerful moment for them?
Well, it certainly was. We had about 20 members or 20 employees of RJR who were in the room watching closing arguments last night. We had victims of the families in the room last night, and many of them were brought to emotion, going over a lot of the footage, a lot of those photos of their loved ones, their co-workers, and the crime scene as well. We did not show those videos on our live stream or on our air, but they did show some of those rather gruesome photos in the courtroom last night. And well, when you talk about someone you love in that kind of setting, obviously it's going to bring about a lot of emotion from their standpoint. And if from the state standpoint and from the defense's standpoint, having those closing arguments, it really was putting a final recap, a quick run through of events. As you noted, we've been watching this testimony for the past few weeks. A lot of evidence, a lot of objections, a lot of overruled objections. We saw just a lot of information and a witness list of more than 100 individuals. By all accounts, this was a rather lengthy and exhausting trial for the jury as well as those who were putting it together and any of the victims' families and friends who were watching on board as well. So from the state standpoint, they just went through the timeline of events, reliving that April 1st, 2019 in a different way. While we were going through the testimony, while the state was calling their witnesses and submitting their evidence, they didn't refer to Chad Isaak by name. They called it the suspect. They followed this person in the video, not putting a name to Chad Isaak's name, the suspect, in that context while going through it. It wasn't until very late that we heard the very first investigator said that they thought the suspect was Chad Isaak. Shortly thereafter, it was the defense who tried to bring about any kind of gaps in that video, any kind of objections, any kind of mishandling of evidence. At the end of the day, many investigators said that none of the evidence was mishandled, none of the evidence was corrupted. While yes, the original call on April 1st was for a medical call, and there were lots of individuals coming in and out of that building, they said that they were able to maintain what they've been calling the integrity of that crime scene, holding that evidence together at least enough to reach that point to where they were able to pinpoint what they said was only one suspect. So when we were going through the closing arguments just the other day, just yesterday morning, the state put the whole timeline with that suspect's name in the storyline. And that's what brought a lot of people to emotion yesterday, not just the photos and having to relive those events, but honestly, for the first time while going through this testimony, there were characters in this narrative. The suspect had a name. The suspect had a face. And that's what the jury was watching yesterday for the very first time. So when we're talking about what we're going to be seeing today, it's going to be whether or not the jury believes that name, that face, is the person underneath that mask in the video. And when we're going over all of this, while we're thinking about what the jury might be thinking, the defense is thinking, were they able to make their point? Because it seemed as though from the very beginning, the defense's path was going to be victory through determining reasonable doubt. Their goal was to
Jacob,
say
I'm going to cut
that
you
the
off
video
there.
they showed
Apologies
doesn't
there. We
pinpoint
hear
Chad
that
Isaak.
the jury is now being seated, so we're going to take a listen into the courtroom live now.